Lecture 7, on Ethics, Contemporary Moral Problems. Part 2, Metaethics. In agreement with our text, we will divide this chapter into 2 lectures since it is quite long. 1. Metaethics, an introduction. As our text says, the prefix meta, just as in metaphysics, is derived from the Greek word for beyond. It goes beyond ethics in that, metaethics isn't primarily concerned with developing moral theories intended to guide our behavior to be moral, as in normative ethics discussed in Part 1 of this text and Lectures 1 through 6. Neither is it particularly concerned with establishing how one ought to act in particular situations, or how to apply normative ethical theories to govern our behavior, as we analyze in Part 3 of our text, Applied Ethics. Metaethics is concerned with how normative and applied ethics work. The metaethicist asks questions, provides comments, and raises concerns regarding normative and applied ethics. For example, if a normative ethicist claims that something is morally good, or makes an act morally good, the metaethicist might ask, what do you mean by morally, and what do you mean by good? If a utilitarian answered, utility, the metaethicist would ask, why does utility determine what is good? 2. The value of metaethics. One straightforward critique of metaethics is that the questions asked are so fundamental and, possibly, irreducible that anything that resembles progress couldn't be more than conjecture, or as our text says, pointless, academia for academia's sake. However, some degree of metaethics is unavoidable in the development of a normative ethical theory or in our selection of an ethical theory for application in our lives. We ask ourselves, is this conception of good actually moral good? We also analyze how each theory works and subject them to criticism during our assessments. Furthermore, without asking these fundamental questions, how can we hope to build any moral theory with a stable foundation? As our text asks, how can we attempt applied mathematics without first learning how to add? The results of metaethics may only produce arbitrary axioms to fill these foundational voids, but there is also the possibility for the refinement of existing theories that could bring us closer to truth. This alone makes the enterprise of metaethics, though frustrating, worthwhile. 3. Cognitivism versus non-cognitivism. Following our text, when we discuss moral cognitivism or moral non-cognitivism, from now on, moral will be omitted in word but assumed in meaning. In other words, when I say cognitivism, I mean moral cognitivism, and so on. Our text also notes that there are 2 different conceptions of cognitivism considered together in our text, namely, semantic and psychological cognitivism. Semantic cognitivism is merely the way we understand moral statements to be true. On semantic cognitivism, moral statements are thought to be true in the same way that factual statements are, that is, they are true when they accurately represent moral features of the world. It is only a theory explaining the kind of meaning a moral statement has. Semantic cognitivism does not include a theory of the world containing aspects that are factually moral. Psychological cognitivism is the position that when we make moral statements, we are expressing a belief about something's morality. Therefore, semantic and psychological cognitivism taken together maintain that moral statements are believed by the speaker and can be either true or false. Semantic non-cognitivism is the view that moral statements are more like exclamations, in that they merely communicate attitudes or feelings that are not reflective of the world. In other words, the statement, murder is wrong, is only true in that you have the feeling that it is wrong, and not that it is a fact of the world. Psychological non-cognitivism holds that morally charged statements are not expressions of cognitive beliefs but expressions of emotional desires, preferences, or intentions. 4. Realism versus AntiRealism. Moral realism and moral AntiRealism, like cognitivism, will henceforth be referred to simply as realism and AntiRealism. Realism is the belief that moral claims are true or false regardless of what anyone believes. In other words, moral truths are facts of the world. AntiRealism is the position that no such mind-independent, objective, or moral properties exist. While some of these seem obviously compatible, in what follows, we will examine these in different combinations that form metaethical theories. 5. The Metaethical Map. It will be beneficial to group together the theories that we will examine in a map, or graph, and re-examine our text's explanations of the broad categories covered in sections 3 and 4. Some of the theories that will be of discussion are naturalism and intuitionism, which are both cognitivist and realist theories. These are cognitivist in that they hold moral claims to be beliefs of moral facts of the world, and realist in that they claim moral facts actually exist in the world. Another is moral error theory, which is cognitivist, but anti-realist. A theory in this quadrant would be cognitivist in that it holds moral claims to be beliefs of moral facts of the world, but anti-realist in that they claim moral facts do not actually exist in the world. One that is non-cognitivist, but realist is Carney's theory. A theory in this quadrant would be non-cognitivist in that moral claims would be merely emotional attitudes, but also facts of the real world. While emotivism and prescriptivism are both non-cognitivist and anti-realist. Theories in this quadrant would hold that moral claims are emotional attitudes, not beliefs, and also that they are not facts of the real world. This is an oversimplified set of descriptions, as I am explaining them, but, as you build your own moral maps and reread the corresponding sections, you will be able to make better sense of the categories that compose each of the discussed moral theories. 6. Cognitivist and Realist Theory 1. Naturalism. To speak of naturalists generally, they hold that there are moral facts of the world that justify our moral beliefs. Furthermore, these moral properties are as available to the natural sciences as the properties of wet or magnetic. To put it another way, Gilbert Hammond suggests that we must concentrate on finding the place of value and obligation in the world of facts as revealed by science. What this seems to suggest is that when analyzing the moral claim that murder is wrong, what makes this claim true ought to be included in a set of facts that are analyzable by the natural sciences. There are many challenges to this idea, such as that advanced by Simon Blackburn, who outlines the desirability and purpose of commitment to naturalism when he says that the problem is one of finding room for ethics, or placing ethics within the disenchanted, non-ethical order which we inhabit and of which we are a part. Though he presupposes an anti-realist view in this statement when considered in isolation, it seems intuitive when we consider what set of facts might be available for scientific investigation when considering murder in the abstract or an actual instance of murder in the real world. It seems to be true in either case that the only facts that could be considered in purely scientific terms are that a life ceased and that it was caused by another person. From this, we cannot derive a principle any stronger than, it is wrong for people to end other people's lives, and that would be generous since the empirical evidence doesn't provide us with what makes the life-taking wrong. Indeed, without this piece, the designation of wrong could be attributed arbitrarily to instances of murder, self-defense, or legal execution. This difficulty arises specifically from an effort to avoid other difficulties such as appealing to non-natural justifications like God, Platonic forms, and other supernatural elements that are dubious with regard to the real world and ordinary science. Utilitarianism is an example of a naturalist moral theory. This is because the moral good according to utilitarianism is utility, which is reducible to happiness, is a feature of the natural world in terms of neural chemistry, and the utilitarian has a cognitive belief that happiness is the moral good. Philippa Foot and Rosalind Hursthouse have argued for a naturalist conception of Aristotelian virtue ethics, citing that our feelings, biology, and social dynamics are all open to scientific evaluation. Gilbert Hammond also argues that naturalism inevitably results in relativism since many facts of the natural world are subject to change over time. Hammond thinks that if the moral good is grounded in the natural world, then the moral good is also subject to change over time. However, Michael Smith claims that naturalism is irrelevant to the debate between moral relativism and absolutism. Smith argues that the natural or unnatural grounding of morality has nothing to do with the difference between relativists and absolutists, rather they differ on questions regarding the rationality of human behavior. 7. Objections to Naturalism. G. E. Moore was a pioneer in analytic philosophy who supported cognitivism and realism but rejected naturalism. One reason he rejected naturalism was that he regarded moral properties as fundamentally simple. Good is good and it is not reducible to any other properties, natural or unnatural. Using an argument by analogy between color properties and moral properties. For example, the concept of a horse can be broken down into composite concepts like size, shape, mammalian qualities, etc. However, the color yellow is fundamentally simple and cannot be broken down into any composite concepts. More argues that the same is true of moral good. More explains, if I am asked, what is good, my answer is that good is good, and that is the end of the matter. Or if I am asked, how is good to be defined, my answer is that it cannot be defined, and that is all I have to say about it. Another way naturalism is rejected is through More's open question argument. More suggests that we consider a claim like, giving to charity is good, and follow the naturalist by reducing the good to the natural property of pleasure. Now the claim is that, giving to charity is pleasurable. However, according to More, it is still an open question as to whether creating pleasure is actually good. The question remains meaningful in a way that it should not if the good is actually reducible to pleasure. Julia Tanner provides similar open question examples and refers to the naturalistic fallacy that we introduced in Lecture 1, which holds that something can be morally good by reducing it to naturally occurring properties such as pleasure. Our text concludes this section with a brief note on how these arguments can also serve as challenges to non-naturalistic reductions of goodness. 8. Cognitivist and realist theory 2, Non-Naturalism. Some non-naturalist moral theorists hold that moral properties are not natural properties we can discover empirically, but rather, we intuit them with our moral sense. Thus, these views are also called intuitionist. For example, Richard Price suggested that truths are intuited when they are acquired, without making any use of any process of reasoning. More recently, W.D. Ross suggested that we intuit self-evident moral truths, without any need of proof, or of evidence beyond itself. The intuitionist realist may be able to avoid the challenges of the open question argument and the naturalistic fallacy since what we intuit are fundamentally simple moral principles and not reducible to natural properties in the world. 9. Objections to intuitionism. The first objection entertained in our text is that intuitionism struggles to explain moral disagreement. As our text asks, if moral truths are self-evident and can be intuited, then why do even self-professed intuitionists such as More and Ross have radically different ethical views? In response, Ross suggests that we have varying levels of maturity and tuning to all of our faculties, and as our faculties mature, they become better able to pick up on features of the world. Therefore, different people with different levels of maturity will pick up on moral properties differently, explaining moral disagreements. Likewise, Samuel Clarke suggests that stupidity can also lead our intuitions astray, leading to more moral disagreements. Another objection comes from those who endorse the verification principle. The verification principle states that any statements that cannot be empirically verified or shown true by definition are meaningless. This is a problematic view since the statement, any statements that cannot be empirically verified or shown true by definition are meaningless, cannot itself be empirically verified or shown true by definition. But our text entertains it anyway, pointing out that verificationists could conclude that moral statements, if intuitionism is correct, would be meaningless in virtue of our inability to verify such statements. Finally, our text returns to the problem of moral disagreement, pointing out that intuitions can be fickle and are better understood as irrational moral judgments expressing our own feelings or personal beliefs, rather than judgments giving voice to the existence of mind-independent, objective, non-natural moral properties. To illustrate this, the trolley problem thought experiment is reintroduced. In the standard case we have been discussing, people will typically opt to pull the lever to save 5 lives over 1. However, our text introduces a second version of the trolley problem where we don't have a lever, but we could push a very large person onto the tracks to stop the train. In the second version, people will usually opt to let the 5 people die. This divergence is intended to illustrate that our moral intuitions are more likely irrational moral judgments expressing our feelings rather than judgments giving voice to the existence of non-natural moral properties. Instead of assigning questions for reflection, this time I simply recommend rereading the first half of this chapter until you are comfortable with the material before we attempt to tackle the remainder of the chapter next time.